Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the Spawn #1 cover. Nicholas Caprio recently left this question on my Instagram page. Thank you for the question, Nicholas. It reads, can you talk about what non-Bible records exist of the historical Jesus? And the reality is that there are no records of any kind that exist of the historical Jesus. Our concept of the historical Jesus is a hypothetical reconstruction that we make from analysis of the biblical and other texts. They all reflect the tradition that developed after Jesus' death of his resurrection, his divinity, his messiahship. And so I would say there aren't historical records that talk about the historical Jesus at all. That's a reconstruction. But there are 3 texts that come from within about a century of Jesus' death that are considered by scholars to reflect knowledge of traditions in circulation about the life, death, and putative resurrection of Jesus. Probably the earliest comes from the mid-90s CE from the writer Josephus. There are 2 references in his work, The Judean Antiquities, to Jesus who was called Christ. The first comes from Book 20, Chapter 9, Paragraph 1. And I say this is not a great translation because this is the Whiston translation, which is pretty outdated and also pretty biased. But this talks about the execution of James. And James is described as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. And virtually all scholars accept the authenticity of this passage. There are some mythicists who would like it to go away, just like all the other passages we're going to talk about. But this is pretty secure evidence of the execution of James, who was known as the brother of Jesus, who people referred to as Christ or Messiah or Anointed One. The other reference in Josephus is in Book 18, Chapter 3, Paragraph 3, and this is a much longer reference, and most scholars would say this has been expanded on, this has been elaborated on by Christian writers, and this passage is reported in Eusebius's church history in the 4th century CE, so that elaboration and expansion had to have taken place pretty quickly. But we can cross out what scholars think may have been part of that elaboration to isolate what scholars think probably was written by Josephus. And we have some help here. There are a couple of versions of this in Syriac and Arabic that were discovered later that are actually shorter than what we find in the authoritative version. For instance, this is a translation in Arabic written by Agapius in the 10th century, and it is shorter. It pulls out some of those very Christian-sounding testimonies. However, it doesn't quite line up with what scholars think Josephus originally wrote, so it's possible that this has undergone some expansion and some editing as well. But again, the overwhelming majority of scholars would suggest that there is an original, authentic core to this reference to Jesus, but that it has probably been expanded on later by Christians. The next text we have comes from about 112 CE, and this is a letter and a response. The letter is from Pliny the Younger. The response is from the Emperor Trajan, and Pliny is basically asking what he should do with these Christians that he keeps running across, and he reports on what he has done and asks for help from Trajan, and Trajan basically says, "You done good, kid." But the second paragraph here I think is fascinating. Pliny is talking about interrogating and torturing these Christians, and it says, they asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this, they affirmed, they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses, but I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. And then finally, the next one from within a couple of years of Pliny the Younger is that of Tacitus from his text, the Annals. And here we have this statement about Nero torturing and killing Christians. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. And the manuscripts show the Latin transliteration of Christian there with an E, Christian, and some people argue that indicates that Tacitus was referring to someone else, but that was actually a spelling of Christian and even Christ that we find even in Christian texts. For instance, Codex Sinaiticus, where we have the word Christian in Acts, is spelled in Greek with that E vowel instead of an I. So that is not unusual. That does not indicate this is not a reference to Christ or to Christians. It very clearly is. And then there's another vague reference from another author named Suetonius, but it doesn't really say anything about Christ. It just talks about Christians in association with Nero again, and the details don't quite match up with Tacitus's account. And so we've clearly got different traditions in circulation about where these Christians came from and who this Christ was. And these three texts are the closest we get to non-biblical accounts of the life of Jesus from within about a century of Jesus' life.